I didn't expect anything meaningful when I accepted the short-term position. It was supposed to be quiet work, generous pay, and a clean exit. That was my plan. I would arrive, do what was asked, keep my head down, and leave with my life unchanged. I didn't know then how fragile that promise was, or how easily it would break the moment I met Alexander. Everyone called him the king, though no one ever said it to his face. The title floated through hushed conversations and careful glances, carried by the weight of his influence rather than a crown. Alexander Hale owned half the city without ever raising his voice. His presence alone seemed to rearrange rooms. When he walked in, people straightened. When he spoke, they listened. And when he was alone, which was often, the silence around him felt deliberate, almost protective. That I met him on my first evening. He stood by the tall windows of his private residence, the city lights reflecting faintly in his glass of untouched whiskey. He was older than me by more than a decade, sharp-featured, impeccably dressed, and visibly tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. When he turned and offered his hand, his smile was polite but distant, as if warmth was something he rationed carefully. "Ethan," I said, giving my name. "Stay as long as you need to settle in," Alexander replied. His voice was calm, practiced. "You won't be disturbed here." That sentence would echo in my head later, long after I understood its meaning. The first days passed uneventfully. My role placed me near him but never truly with him, organizing schedules, handling quiet tasks, staying useful without being seen. Alexander preferred order and discretion. He moved through his days with precision, rarely lingering, rarely distracted. Yet there were moments when I caught him staring into nothing, as if the world paused when no one was watching. That we spoke little at first. When we did, it was restrained, almost formal. But I noticed how his posture softened when our conversations drifted away from business. He asked about my background, my childhood, the places I'd lived. No one had asked me questions like that in years, not with genuine interest, not without an agenda. One night, long after the staff had retired to their quarters, I found him in the library. He sat surrounded by books he wasn't reading, the lamplight casting shadows across his face. "You work too late," I said before thinking that he glanced up, surprised, then smiled faintly. "So do you." We talked then, not about work, not about money or power, but about loneliness. Carefully, indirectly, like men circling a truth neither was ready to name. Alexander spoke of expectations placed on him long before he had a choice. He mentioned a partner, someone chosen for appearances, stability, and silence. There was no bitterness in his voice, only resignation. "I've done everything right," he said quietly. "I just don't know when right stopped feeling right. I should have left the room." Instead, I sat across from him. In the days that followed, our conversations became routine. Breakfasts extended longer than scheduled. Walks through the gardens replaced formal meetings. He laughed more with me than I had seen him laugh with anyone else. It wasn't flirtation. It was recognition, two people acknowledging the same ache from opposite sides of the world. Still, I reminded myself of the line that couldn't be crossed. Alexander belonged to another life, one built on commitments I had no right to challenge. I was temporary. Replaceable. I told myself this every night as I returned to my room, replaying our conversations like unfinished songs. The invitation came quietly. It was my final evening. My bags were packed. The car was scheduled for dawn. I found Alexander on the terrace, watching the city settle into darkness. "You're leaving tomorrow," he said, not turning around. "Yes," I answered. "That was always the plan." He nodded, as if weighing something unseen. Then, after a long pause, he looked at me, not as a king, not as a man in control, but as someone tired of being alone. "Stay," he said. "Just a little longer." There was no command in his voice. No power. Only need, and in that moment, standing at the edge of a decision I didn't yet understand, I realized that leaving would be easy, staying would change everything. I told myself I was staying for practical reasons. One more week wouldn't hurt. Alexander needed help finishing a few matters, and I wasn't in a hurry to return to a life that felt just as empty as the one I was temporarily leaving behind. That was the story I repeated until it sounded convincing. Still, something shifted the moment I unpacked my bag again. The decision settled in my chest like a quiet admission. Alexander didn't mention my extended stay at first. He carried on as though it had always been expected, though I noticed a subtle ease in him, a loosening at the edges. His schedule changed without explanation. Meetings shortened. Evenings stretched. The house felt less like a residence and more like a refuge we were slowly building without saying so. Our conversations deepened in ways that felt inevitable. We spoke in fragments at first, testing how much honesty the other could bear. Alexander told me about the performance his life required, the dinners, the appearances, the relationship that looked perfect from a distance and felt hollow up close. He never spoke cruelly of his partner, only carefully, as though each word carried weight he couldn't afford to misplace. With them, I'm always aware of who I'm supposed to be, he said one night as we sat in the garden. With you, I forget. That confession landed heavier than any touch could have. I felt it in the pause that followed, in the way my breath caught before I answered. I wanted to tell him that I understood, that I felt the same pull, the same dangerous sense of ease. Instead, I changed the subject. Cowardice can sound like politeness if you dress it well enough. Days blurred into a rhythm that belonged only to us. Morning coffee turned into shared silence. Walks became longer, slower. Sometimes we said nothing at all, and it felt intimate in a way words never managed. I noticed how Alexander watched me when he thought I wasn't looking, how his guarded expression softened when he laughed. I also noticed the guilt that crept in afterward, like a shadow that followed him from room to room that I tried to create distance. I reminded myself of the imbalance between us, his power, his obligations, his other life. I told myself that what we were doing was harmless, that no vows had been broken because no rules had been spoken aloud. Yet the truth pressed closer each day. We were sharing something meant to belong elsewhere. One evening, the tension finally surfaced. We were alone in the library again, the same room where everything had begun. The air felt heavier, charged with words neither of us had said. Alexander stood near the window, his back to me, hands clasped as though holding himself together. This isn't fair to you, he said quietly. I know that. The admission startled me. I hadn't realized how badly I needed him to acknowledge it. I stood, uncertain whether to move closer or farther away. You haven't done anything wrong, I replied, though the words tasted false even as I spoke them. That he turned then, and for the first time, he didn't look composed. He looked afraid. I think about you constantly, he said. And I don't know what that makes me. It was the closest he came to crossing the line. He didn't reach for me. He didn't ask for anything. He simply told the truth, and in doing so, placed it between us like an open door that I should have walked through the other one. Instead, I stayed where I was. That I told him that I wasn't asking for promises. That I wasn't trying to take anything from him. I told him I knew the situation, that I accepted the limits. Every word sounded reasonable. Every word was a lie we agreed to share. From that night on, the unspoken became impossible to ignore. We avoided physical closeness, yet everything else felt intimate. Shared glances, unfinished sentences, the comfort of being understood without explanation. I had become his confidant, his escape, the place his mind went when the rest of his life closed in, and somewhere in that quiet understanding, I realized the truth I had been avoiding, that I was no longer just staying, that I was choosing him, and once that choice was made, I wasn't sure there was a way back. The change didn't arrive loudly. It crept in through small fractures, missed calls Alexander didn't explain, meetings he left early with an expression too carefully blank, a tension that lingered long after our conversations ended. The world he belonged to was pressing in again, reminding him of the life he couldn't abandon simply because it had begun to hurt. That I felt it most when he wasn't with me. The absence carried weight now. I had become accustomed to his presence, to the way he listened without interruption, to the rare ease he allowed himself in my company. That familiarity was dangerous. It made the truth harder to ignore. I was living inside a pause, and pauses are never meant to last. One evening, Alexander returned late, his composure strained thin. He didn't sit beside me as usual. Instead, he stood near the doorway, as if unsure whether to enter the room fully. "They know something is wrong," he said. "Who?" I asked, though I already understood. "My partner. The people around us." He exhaled slowly. "I've been careless." The word landed between us like an accusation, though I knew it wasn't meant as one. Careless didn't mean cruel. It meant human. Still, guilt surfaced immediately, sharp and unwelcome. I thought of the life he returned to each night, of the quiet lies required to protect it. I thought of myself, hidden in plain sight, asking for nothing while taking everything that mattered. "This was never your fault," he added quickly, reading my silence. "I chose this closeness." I nodded, but the reassurance didn't settle me. Choice implied intention, and intention carried responsibility. I had stayed knowing exactly what it meant. I had allowed myself to become essential without asking what that would cost him, or me. That we walked together that night, slower than usual. The gardens were empty, the paths dimly lit. Alexander spoke of duty, of the weight of a life built on expectation. He didn't romanticize it. He didn't ask me to save him. He simply told the truth as he understood it. "I can't give you a future," he said at last. "Not without destroying the one I already have." The honesty hurt more than any rejection could have. It clarified what emotion had blurred. I stopped walking and looked at him, really looked at him, not the king, not the lonely man I'd grown to love, but someone trapped by choices he could no longer undo. "I know," I said. And this time, I meant it. Silence followed, heavy but necessary. For the first time since I'd stayed, there was no pretense left to protect us. I realized then that staying had been easy because it required nothing but patience. Leaving would demand courage. That I spent the rest of the night awake, listening to the house settle, memorizing a place I already knew I couldn't remain in. By morning, the decision felt steady, painful, and unavoidable. When I told Alexander, he didn't argue. "That hurt most of all." "I won't ask you to stay," he said softly. "I don't want to be the reason you disappear into someone else's life." We stood close, closer than we ever had, yet still untouched. There was a tenderness in that restraint, a final respect we owed each other. He thanked me, for the honesty, for the companionship, for reminding him of a part of himself he'd nearly forgotten. That I left before dawn, the same way I had planned 2 weeks earlier. The city looked unchanged, indifferent to what had passed between us. As the car pulled away, I didn't look back. Some endings deserve privacy. Time has a way of softening sharp edges. I carry Alexander with me still, not as regret, but as understanding. I learned that love can exist without permission and still demand consequences. I learned that staying can be a form of escape, and leaving can be an act of care. That he was a king in name and circumstance, but in those quiet moments we shared, he was simply a man who asked me to stay, and I was someone who finally learned when to go. Leaving didn't end things the way I expected. There was no dramatic collapse, no sudden clarity that made everything painless. Instead, life resumed its ordinary pace, and I had to learn how to exist inside it again without Alexander's quiet gravity pulling at me. The absence he left behind was subtle but constant, like a low ache I carried through my days. That I returned to my old routines, but they no longer fit the way they once had. Conversations felt thinner. Even laughter seemed borrowed. I realized how deeply I had grown accustomed to being seen, truly seen, by someone who understood me without explanation. That kind of recognition changes you. It raises a standard you can't easily forget. Weeks passed. Then months. I told myself the story was finished, that it belonged to a sealed chapter one could revisit only in memory. And for the most part, that was true. Until the letter arrived, there was no return address, but I recognized the handwriting immediately. Alexander had always written with deliberate precision, each word measured, each sentence considered. I hesitated before opening it, suddenly aware that some doors, once reopened, never closed the same way again. The letter was short. That he didn't apologize. He didn't ask for forgiveness or offer explanations. Instead, he thanked me, for my honesty, for leaving when he couldn't, for refusing to let what we shared turn into something secret and corrosive. He wrote that his life had grown quieter since I left, but also clearer. That loneliness, once named, was harder to ignore. I don't know what I will become, he wrote. But I know now what I cannot pretend anymore. I read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it somewhere safe. It didn't reopen wounds. It confirmed what I already knew, that what we shared had mattered, even if it couldn't last. That I thought often about the word, king. About how power can isolate as effectively as walls. Alexander had everything a man could want, and yet he had been starving for something simple: connection without performance, presence without expectation. Loving him, even briefly, taught me that loneliness doesn't discriminate. It only waits. That I began to build something new, slowly and without urgency. I allowed myself to be open again, though not careless. I carried the lessons with me, that desire doesn't excuse harm, that staying silent can be a choice just as powerful as leaving, and that sometimes the bravest love is the one that knows when to let go. Every now and then, I wondered what path Alexander chose. Whether he found the courage to reshape his life or settled back into its familiar constraints. I learned not to seek answers I wasn't meant to have. Some connections aren't meant to be resolved. They exist to change us, then step aside. That if there's one truth I hold on to, it's this: I don't regret staying. And I don't regret leaving. That he asked me to stay because he was lonely. That I left because I finally understood myself, and somewhere between those two truths, I became someone stronger, someone honest enough to walk away from a love that couldn't survive the light. Not every story ends with togetherness, some end with clarity, and sometimes, that is enough.